Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's guest is Charlotte Cook, Senior Manager of Trade Analytics and a colleague of mine at Veson Nautical. Charlotte was at VesselValue about a year or so ago, and that company was acquired by Veson Nautical, which was a year after they acquired QD8, where I started from. If you're interested in talking about how the use of AIS has evolved over the past decade, and especially as we've begun to understand more about its data and its benefits beyond its original intention, then this is the podcast for you. Charlotte, welcome to the pod. Thank you for coming on.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for inviting me, firstly, to speak on the podcast. And it's been great to become your colleague over the past year. Joining Veson has been a really wonderful experience. Obviously, we've not only gained colleagues like yourself, but we've got a whole load of new data to work with now, which is very exciting for a data geek like myself.
It's okay. You can nerd out, geek out on anything.
Yeah.
I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd for two things: ships, obviously, and then Star Wars. But this is not a Star Wars podcast. We can talk about that another time. So let's talk about that. I mean, like you said, the last year has been exciting for you. Last 2 years have been exciting for me personally. And just in case if you're wondering, listeners, this is not going to be a 40-minute infomercial about Veson. I promise you, we actually talked about that. So just tell us what you're up to today, and maybe a little bit about about your background and where you've got to today.
A little bit about myself to begin with. I joined at VesselValue back in 2016. I was kind of fresh out of university at the time. I just studied environmental geography and I was looking for the next challenge. I saw the opportunity to work with AIS data and I went for it. Now, VesselValue, as the name suggests, is kind of predominantly focused around our automated valuation system, providing market values, DCF, demo values, and other values. But we also use AIS in some of our products as well, and we use AIS as a data input to verify a lot of the data used within that automated valuation system. And I think that's what I'll be focusing on today. And I think it's something that you've touched on in previous episodes. I know you've touched on the use of AIS data before, but I'm excited to do a deep dive into it today as an AIS data analyst and researcher. So yeah, that's kind of where I've come from. Now that I'm working as part of Veson, I'm extending into some of Veson's ocean bulk products. So some products that are using AIS in slightly different ways to look into trade flow analytic, dark events, things like that. So yeah, it's been an exciting year. You know, when I first joined VesselValue about 8 years ago, we were using AIS data in a very different way. And I think that's why it's interesting to focus on VesselValue as kind of like a case study into how AIS data and the uses of AIS data have changed over that past kind of coming up to a decade. When we began ingesting AIS data in 2013, 2014, you know, there wasn't that much information out there about how to use kind of big data set. And primarily at the time, we were using these AIS data sets to validate our best-in-class vessels database. Vessel database is a really important input into our automated valuation system. And essentially what we were doing at the time was using AIS data to highlight changes in vessel status, you know, whether a vessel's launched, live or dead, to confirm things such as builder yards, scrapping yards, flag changes, even to highlight things such as trading sales. So for us at the time, that AIS data was more of like a secondary source of information. And that's why we primarily began ingesting it in VesselValue. But since then, obviously, we've realized, as everyone else in the maritime industry has, that AIS data has so many more benefits, and combining that base AIS data with other supplementary data sets can really add value in things like tracking aggregated trade flows, you know, aiding port efficiency, and now, you know, really providing insight into vessel emissions and environmental regulation compliance. So yeah, that's a bit about what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, I think let's just start from there. I think just the evolution of AIS data from, like you said, whether it's just a position or to record events, or the ship is, you know, sitting in a port, to this kind of a part of a bigger data set, I think is something that we all see it happen. We all have use for it, whether it's, you know, we had Michelle VC Bachman on a twice, talking about dark events, firstly with Russia, and now more what's less dark events, but more of the events happening in the Red Sea. That's all predicated on AIS data. And having it available, or in some cases not having it available, or in some cases having the wrong stuff on purpose available, right? And it's all these different things. I love to hear kind of some of the big challenges that you as a data analyst, right? And we had Ali Riaz on, who's the CEO of Orbit MI. He said, something that was, I think, one of the best quotes I've had all this year is garbage in, danger out, because it could be danger out, not necessarily even garbage in, garbage out, but dangers out. That could, if you have bad data, it could be dangerous. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've had to encounter as you start to use this for other purposes, whether it's trade flows, dark events, all these other things that you're dealing with, not just you, but other people who wear the same hat in other companies, or the consumer of the AIS data, whether it's, us or somebody else. But there are a lot of people consuming this data, making decisions on that. So talk a little bit about the challenges. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, there's many challenges with working with the data sets themselves. I think one of the main challenges, obviously, primarily AIS was obviously used as a navigational aid, and it's become, since then, it's become a really important tool and a way to make the maritime industry so much more transparent, which I think is incredibly important. And I remember when I started back at VesselValue nearly a decade ago, many within the industry, and you'll know this, Chris, were still quite reluctant to use AIS data and to kind of switch from the more traditional methodologies and practices within the maritime industry. So it's been an interesting decade in the sense that I think now opinions have really changed, and now it's a tool that most people within the maritime industry will end up using in one way or another. So that's kind of more about how the challenges in people adopting AIS data and kind of making decisions based on AIS data. But the data challenges with actually working with the data itself, it's an incredibly dynamic data set. Right. So we ingest the raw data coming from our suppliers, which we then need to process and assign, and then derive AIS data sets from that. We use a lot of logic and algorithms to do that. A lot of it's automated now, but it wasn't always. As I said, I was first employed as an AIS data researcher. So essentially that meant looking into the data, trying to really get a deep understanding of the data. And it was only really when we did that we could start building these much more sophisticated algorithms to ingest and process and assign and match the data. So it's been a real learning process in that sense. Going back to it being an incredibly dynamic data set, what I mean there is it's constantly changing, it's moving, it's growing, which can itself pose challenges. It's not a static data set. The volume of AIS data that we ingest and process is vast, as you'd expect. We're talking about tracking the entire cargo and offshore fleet every minute of every day across every region globally. So you can imagine that's
and then
millions.
we know how that goes. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
You find, and because we're dealing with this issue right now, you find one ship.
Yeah.
We have a client with like two ships. That's not right. And we're like, out of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of data points on a daily basis, that's dynamic. And we still have clients that will find the one thing by no fault of anybody's, but a little switch in something that, because dynamically it was changed. It's an amazing thing. And I really want to point it out to not only our clients, but just people in general. It's not static. It's not like on a conveyor belt. It changes all the time. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I know you and I are dealing with something actually.
Yeah, completely.
we got snake bit. Out of tens of thousands of ships, a client found two.
Yeah.
And he wasn't wrong, but it's interesting.
And, the devil really is in the detail when we start looking at AIS data and using accurate AIS data sets. But we're talking about ingesting millions of rows of data into our systems. So we've really had to work out ways of handling that through our ingestion engines, which has been a challenge, but we've got there, and we're really confident in our kind of matching process now. I'd say another challenge of working with AIS data is the amount of noise that we see in the data. There's a significant amount of cleaning that goes into getting the data to be accurate and reliable. Things such as signal collisions in high traffic areas, data corruption, even invalid data being manually input by the vessel's crew. A really good example that I like to talk about is how we first, years and years ago, kind of spotted the use of second-hand transponders. There's quite a big second-hand transponder market where they were fitting transponders from dead vessels onto brand new vessels. So we'd see the same IMOs and the same MMSIs being reported from new build yards. And, it's kind of finding all of these weird and wonderful quirks in the data and really trying to work out how we can kind of spot patterns and apply logic and algorithms to really try and capture those events. So, yeah. It's certainly an interesting data set to work with. You touched on earlier about AIS spoofing. It's a hot topic when we all talk about AIS, dark periods, AIS being an indicator of vessels conducting illicit activity. One thing worth mentioning around that is that it's not uncommon for vessels to drop in and out of signal for, legitimate reasons as well. So it's about kind of dissecting that information and working and kind of joining that raw AIS data with other data sets, company information, ownership information to really try and highlight events going on in the real world. So there's definitely some challenges.
There is. and what would you say? And again, to be wary of becoming an infomercial for Veson, although marketing would just love it. But what? So we talked about the challenges, which is always good. But what are some of the kind of the really you talked about a lot of the uncovered kind of hidden gems that has been pulled out of AIS data. What are some of the real highlights and for the industry that, let's say, even when you started in this 8 years ago, when I started, they didn't even have AIS data. I know I sound like a dinosaur, but in the time that you started, because really, I mean, it's changed and the challenges, yes, but also what are some of the kind of the changes and the successes and the things that Charlotte from 8 years ago would go, wow, we could do that now. Like, what are some of the really cool things that you've seen in the last couple of years that people are using with AIS data?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. If I cast my mind back to 2016, when I started working with AIS data, we were going into client meetings and talking about how the client would utilize AIS data, and they'd be quite happy mapping and tracking it on a map and, literally seeing where vessels come from and
the best thing ever is people like put up on the screen a map of where all their ships are. It's like the stupidest thing, but it's like when you go into offices, we have that a lot of our products, and clients will put that up. Oh, here's all the ships we have on subs or whatever.
Yeah. And I think now, big data has really taken over in that people are consuming the data differently now. We're using APIs. We're running large scale data analysis and data on these data sets to really gain insight. So I think going forward, there'll probably be more focus on kind of three main things. I think going back to your, sorry, I'm jumping around slightly here, but quickly going back to your point about, what have I know, how can we really add value to AIS data set? And talking about those supplementary databases, databases that we join with AIS data to really, really add value. We're talking about things like polygon data sets, tracking ports, terminals, berths, GIS data sets, gaining information from draft changes and really applying models and algorithms to those data sets to kind of add value and create some of our more interesting products. And I think the reason I really want to focus on that is because AIS data on its own, I'm a big advocate for AIS data, but I completely see that it's not the golden ticket on its own. And, you've got to start pulling in that industry knowledge, people like yourself who've, got real world experience in shipping and those markets. And we apply that information to the AIS data sets to really gain that deep insight into kind of shipping operations and environmental tracking and things like that. But I think going forward, there'll be focus on those three main things. And firstly, all of these things are already being adopted within the maritime industry using AIS data. But I think firstly, optimizing supply chains will become more of a hot topic than it already is. So, you touched earlier on the continued disruption from political events and trade lanes changing because of, the conflicts in the Red Sea and looking at Suez Canal diverts and things like that. So people are really looking for further insight into things such as extra sailing distance, time, speed. And these are all things that we can use AIS data for. And we wouldn't necessarily have the same data sets on such a global scale to really dig into without the use of AIS data. Congestion is another big thing that AIS data can really provide insight on, highlighting bottlenecks and potential waiting times at port, region, and country level. So many are using AIS data for these kind of reasons and to help optimize supply chains. One of the big things that people are talking about at the moment is just-in-time port arrivals, and AIS data can really help out with providing that real-time data. And without it, these things probably wouldn't be so achievable. So I think definitely see AIS data being used for that going forward.
Well, a lot of this is an emissions story, right? Because as owners start to look to improve their efficiency rating, mainly through the CII, and like it or not, it's the world we live in today. Will that change? Probably. There's a lot of discussions about this. They're going to have another MEPC meeting in IMO, but let's just take it at face value today. It is what it is, saying that these sort of things all become part of looking at CII ratings, looking at carbon emissions, looking at when you go into the zones, when you go out of the zones, and comparing that to when you're switching off or switching fuels or not, and all these different regulatory items that are coming into, which at one point was just regulatory. Now they have commercial value because of the EU ETS. Mm-hmm. And then you have a whole other layer of verifying this. And I'm sure that verifying it is going to be documentation that's going to involve AIS. So it's all the data, like you said, in and of itself is not the golden ticket, but you have to marry it with other data and real world insights to really unleash the full potential.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned CII. When the regulations came out, obviously, but before that, we decided that we needed to create a really good model to capture CII banding. And we did that using the IMO's methodology, as well as all of our data and vessel specification inputs, engine data, fuel consumption, things like that. So we're really lucky to have a really talented data scientist and data research team. So we can combine all of these teams together, all of these data points, and come out with a really good final result to help our clients monitor this data and stick to the regulations that they need to, touching on optimizing vessel efficiency and increasingly kind of monitoring environmental regulations, because people are having to. That's certainly going to be the future of using AIS data for sure. We're already seeing it, we're already seeing people starting to become really interested in these data sets for those reasons. And I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon.
You talk about the challenges, that's kind of bring me to, dovetails really nicely, or sorry, the future. It dovetails really nicely to my next question, which is, been doing this for 8 years. As the company grows, as your kind of purview grows a little bit, what do you see as somebody who's been studying and immersed in this data for the time that you've been doing this? What do you see next? I mean, you kind of hinted a little bit on some of the, of course, on some of the emissions, but where else do you see this data growing, and where do you see this going in the next, couple of years? I'm not going to ask you to say in the next 8 years, because who the heck knows, but certainly in the next few years, where do you see this going? And I think the other part to frame this is, talking to clients or SMEs within the company, or clients, or reading news, how are you positioning kind of what you're doing with kind of the needs of the market? So those are like two questions together there.
Yeah, well, I think obviously, as I just said, definitely we'll see AIS data being more heavily used for environmental regulatory reasons. We've got people tracking vessels into ECAs, MPAs, the kind of ESG side of things will certainly, as I know you were speaking about last week on your podcast, will certainly evolve in the next couple of years. Also, I'd say we'll continue to see clients using the data to track trades and forecasting of trading movements and commodity flows and things like that. It's something that we do in our in our ocean bulk product. And this is a great example of where we use additional data sets to provide further insight, commodities data sets, understanding of common and expected commodity trade flows and routes, and things like that, and actually having that insight into historical voyages and cargo flows. I think we'll see a lot more of our clients utilizing the data, the AIS derived data, for those reasons. The more history we have in AIS, the better we can build and train our models as well. But big advantage of being able to use AIS data to monitor these things is the reach is truly global. We can extend analysis into every corner of the world, coverage permitting. I think we'll continue to see a big focus on the Asia Pacific region, especially in terms of tracking volumes and ensuring efficient maritime operations in some of those really high traffic areas. But to give a truly global picture, we want to capture trades, happening at really small barge to anchorage loading ports off some remote island in Papua New Guinea. So it's really about, having that global view, and that's what AIS data essentially gives you. The other great thing is we track, a whole host of different vessel types. So there are a lot of benefits to using AIS data. And I know I talked a lot about the challenges, but actually once you get your head around it and start to understand the nature of the data and start to be able to kind of work with its quirks, it's an incredible data set. And I think really now it's a no-brainer for companies within the maritime space to not be, leveraging AIS data sets in one way or another.
Absolutely. One thing I do, go back to training for a second, training the data models. One thing that strikes me is that, we've had such an upheaval in trade lanes, and you could go back even just 4 years, COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now the issues in the Red Sea. The interesting thing is to see how those models react, because what they are trained for is changing on a, from a trade lane perspective, is changing on the daily. I look back at my experience just back maybe 12, 15 years ago when West Africa, which crude oil used to go primarily to the U.S. East Coast, and then that all shut down after the kind of the Great Recession, whatever it's called, and that all that oil had to go to other places. As a matter of fact, it shut down so much they stopped trading it on the Baltic. It was TD5, and now they go TD20. But if you were trying to train a model on that, in the middle of that, it would look a little funky, because the model's saying one thing, and what's happening in reality is something different.
Yeah, and I think, granted, it's difficult to predict some of these things, right? So we're talking about building models and algorithms. As a data analytics and research team, I like to think that we kind of sit between the engineering and commercial teams, in that we can change the way that we build models, and we can tweak things to kind of adapt to those real world scenarios. I completely see your point. Some of this is difficult to predict, and sometimes happens out of the blue, right?
Yeah.
And that's why it's so great having joined Veson and having access to so many people's knowledge and within this industry, because we can actually build some of these things in as and when they happen. We can retrain models, we can reprocess data. Everything's kind of built in such a way that we can do that. So I think there's an amount of flexibility in some of the things that we do, to kind of account for those real world situations. Yes, we're a data and a software company, but we also have the experience and the knowledge of people like yourselves and many others. So we certainly tie that in with our AIS data sets, which I think is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, I joke around, a little bit on the podcast, as well as, in other venues. And I say, you have a startup company or any company, you don't want to have, 50 people running around from my school, right? Like shipping people, like as much as I love my school and the industry, no, you don't want to have that. At the same time, you don't want to have 50 non-shipping people running around. You got to find that nice balance, because I think that it's really great when somebody with my background and yours could chat and try to solve a problem together, whether it's for Veson or another company. I think it actually is additive to the industry at the end of the day, because I think that, especially when you with remote work, I know we both do a level of remote work. You can have people with different backgrounds, with different experiences, and that actually is very good for the industry and for the company as well. As we start to wind down here, I do love to ask this question. And that is, you're in the shipping industry. Even though you say, "Oh, I'm not a man," you're 8 years in, uh, rewinding a little bit, talking
Yeah.
to a younger version of yourself out of university, and maybe a neighbor, maybe a mentee, somebody that you work with, uh, and says, "Charlotte, I could come and I could work for Veson or another company like this, or I could go do something else." What would you say to them about the merits of coming into the maritime space?
Yeah, I think it's been a big learning curve for sure, especially having worked with the data sets that I work with. There's been a big amount of overcross between, the AIS data sets that I work with and the vessel specification data sets that we work with. But it's been such an interesting ride. I've learned so much from people like yourselves and from my colleagues in the data research space. I'd say there's a lot of companies out there now within the maritime industry doing similar things to what we're doing. But as I said earlier, I think the devil's in the detail. And I think there are couple of key things that are going to kind of take us to the next level, leveraging AIS data.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to make sure that companies have really robust and accurate base foundation data sets to work with. I think you can aggregate data in as many different ways as you want, but without an accurate foundation data set, your aggregations will never be as good as they could be. So that's something we focus heavily on in VV and invest on, and that's something that I've definitely learned over the years, and kind of something that I've taken from my years at university and things like that. And I think secondly, it's about striking a balance between the data sets that we use. As I said before, AIS data on its own is not the golden ticket, but combined with other robust data sets and models, it can be hugely beneficial. And I think without it, we'd really be lacking some real insight into vessel movement and behavior at scale. So yeah, few summary words from me there, but
I absolutely love it. And my final question
mm-hmm.
is the following. I know you're busy, your family and everything, because we talked about before. It was recently Mother's Day in the UK.
Yeah.
Happy belated Mother's Day. So you have a lot of time. You don't have a lot of time in here. You do this. You go. Besides children's books, what are you reading? And let me just preface this by saying a good answer is also I am listening to audiobooks. I think the first guest that I had, similar profile to you, younger person with younger kids, and he was like, "Chris, I just listen to audiobooks. I can't read because I got two little kids." So saying that, are you reading anything that you'd like to share with us, or and I don't know, maybe you'll surprise me. Are you writing anything? I've had a few people who say that they're writing some books, maybe about
No.
the history of the world in AIS. Oh, I don't know if anybody's written that. There you go, Charlotte.
I'm definitely not an author. I've got a couple of things. So I've just finished reading Into Thin Air, which is John Krakauer's account of his Everest expedition.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
I know, slightly random, but
That's okay.
I'm into a non-fiction climbing read, and I think it's probably because I live vicariously through them.
All right,
you
that's
know,
good. I like
with the
that.
children now, I'm certainly not going to be climbing Everest anytime soon. But apart from that, I'm actually partial to doing a crossword. I
Oh,
don't know if you have crosswords in the US. I assume you do.
yeah, yes, we
Kind
do.
of like a word
Yeah,
puzzle.
yeah. No, not one of my strengths. I usually run out of patience, and then I just
I guess it speaks to my problem solving kind of mind.
yes, absolutely. That's a perfectly good example. Crosswords or whatever is perfect is a perfectly
my
good one. Yeah.
my husband does Sudoku and I do the crossword. That's our thing.
Sudoku, yeah, and then
Yeah.
the other big ones. My mother-in-law does Sudoku.
Okay.
She's a big Sudoku fan. She's been doing it for I mean, like as long as I can remember, 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
And my wife, my mom, and my sister-in-law do Wordle. And
Yes.
they get the Wordle puzzle and they have a little Wordle group that, oh, I got it in four. And again, these are things that like my capacity, like Scrabble and stuff,
Hmm.
it's not there. It's like, okay, I could do this for a little while and then
Yeah,
I
yeah.
need
Well,
to
that
move on with life.
is it an interesting or not so interesting fact about me, Chris, but there we go.
No, it's all good. Well, Charlotte, this was a fantastic conversation, and I think it's a really interesting topic to talk about data, especially AIS data, because we talk about it, we use it, we do so much, but we haven't had somebody come on, and I'm grateful that you did to talk about kind of the history of it and really how we've gone from base uses of navigation and this is where the ship is to all these other things and potentially where it's going in the future. So, Charlotte, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I feel like we could have talked for much longer, but
We can do a part two some other time.
yeah.
I've been doing these roundtables lately, and I've done a cyber roundtable. I think I'm going to do one about. I think I'm going to do one about like money and fundraising, and maybe I'll do a data one sometime next year. We'll have you
Yeah.
come on. It'll be fantastic,
We can get
Charlotte.
some colleagues involved for sure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Charlotte Cook. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Chris.